as the next in our Mackrell International Mentor Series, I'm delighted to have with us from Adelaide, Australia, our Australian member, Mark Stewart, not only managing partner of Arionlegal, but also entrepreneur and musician. And when we first spoke, introducing myself as the MD of Mackrell International and Mark introducing himself and his firm, he started telling me about his life journey from Coventry in the UK through Southern Africa into Asia and ultimately to Australia. And we talked about all the different elements that have built your life and professional journey so far. And they are a checkerboard of experience, which is why I think today's session is going to be so interesting, because you have seen both sides of the curtain and had a variety of experience across your life, and you are phenomenally creative. So I want to open today's session by saying, Mark, UK, Africa, Australia, Asia, North America, they've all left a trail in you and as part of you. Who are you?
It's quite funny, actually, that you say that, Keith, because when people ask me, where I'm from, I find it hard to answer that question, actually, because I'm really from so many places. And we moved out to, my dad must have been an adventurous spirit, and he decided that he wanted to move out to Africa. Took a job as a town engineer in Mufulira, which is about 15 or 20 k's from the Congo border in northern Zambia. So we were going from Gravesend in Kent to Mufulira in the north of Zambia. Anyway, we left Southampton in December, and there's a picture of us all in our anoraks, like freezing. And then the next thing, we arrive in Cape Town in January, and it's just magic, absolutely magic. I thought, oh wow, this is like being on permanent holiday. So anyway, we drove in with a car and a caravan all the way up from Cape Town to Zambia, which is about 2 weeks. So by the time we got there, I reckon my mum must have been pretty frazzled. In fact, I remember when my dad first raised the idea, she said to him, "Well, you go, I'll stay behind," Anyway, he obviously managed to persuade her to take it on. So then I spent a few years living in Zambia and had a wonderful time. It was like all my summers had come at once. And even though I was a little redhead and I had to be a bit careful in the sun, and I did get nailed a few times, but anyway, then I went to boarding. Well, actually, quite an interesting little sort of anecdote here is I went to boarding school, but for one term I was in the senior school in Mufulira, and I was the only white person in that school. And it was I guess it's not often you get that opportunity to be like that, where you're the complete minority, like absolute minority, and you're the only one. And it was quite a strange feeling, actually. And I always think back to that and wonder if it colored my view of things at all. I didn't get hassled at all. I was perfectly fine. There was no bullying or anything, strangely. Maybe if I'd stayed there for longer than one term, things might have gone awry. But anyway, we moved on and we went down to Rhodesia, as it was then, and I went to sort of normal school there. How much of this do you want me to keep going?
So there's a spirit of adventure there. You, as you touched on, your father's obviously, quite happy to challenge the norms and take the whole family down to, not even Lusaka or Ndola in Zambia, and
Yeah.
and set you up there. And so he's dragged the family there. And then sadly he died when you were 18. And you said that sort of set you on a different path, because you didn't start, I think, your young life with law in mind.
No. No, I was actually, to be honest, I always thought I'd be a musician. That was always my grand vision. You know, I started a band when I was 15 at school, and you know, that band continues to this day. My dad died. I was in the army at the time. Actually, I'd just gone in. We were conscripted in those days, and so I had to do a year in the army. But I had applied for university before I went in, which was quite lucky because they kept extending it once you were in, because there was a shortage of people. And but my dad got cancer, and he died very quickly in the space of a few months. And he was only 45. So he was quite young, and he left us largely penniless because he'd ceded his life insurance policies to get equity in a business that he'd got involved in. So, and my mum, you know, she was working, but she was working in a sort of a clerical job, so not really able to support, you know, the kids and everything. So we ended up relying very heavily on the church and also on the Freemasons. My dad had become a Freemason, not, you know, about I don't know, maybe a year before he died or something, which was fortuitous actually. And so I was able to, there was no money to go to university, but I was able to get a couple of Rhodesian government grants, as they were then. And the Freemasons paid for my res, I think. And so I was actually able to go to university in a situation where, you know, there was no money at all. I mean, I had to hitchhike down from Bulawayo to Grahamstown, which is where I went, which was about a 4-day, you're on the road for about 4 days, you know. And not only that, but the country was still at war, right? So my mum would drop me off outside town, and you'd sort of get a lift with somebody and say, "What are you doing hitchhiking here?" You know, and they'd sort of take you through to the border, which was about 300 k's, and you know, hope you weren't going to get ambushed along the way. So it was all very exciting and more adventure, I suppose.
And is that why you started off looking to study journalism?
Yeah, so I was the eldest in the family. There was obviously not a lot of money. I had a feeling that somewhere along the line I was going to have to be looking after my mum, if not the others. And so I thought, well, instead of just doing a BA, because I should explain, to do an LLB in South Africa in those days, it was a postgrad degree. So you had to do an undergrad degree first, a 3-year, you know, degree, in which you would do a legal theory, you do a major in law, and also in another major, you had to do 2 majors. So I thought, you know, if I don't end up having enough money to carry on do the postgrad thing, which is quite likely, maybe journalism would be something a bit more useful than just having an ordinary BA. To be honest, what I really wanted to do was drama and music, but those plans went a bit out the window. So I embarked on a journalism course, and it was quite funny because the journalism faculty was very kind of quite left and sort of, you know, laissez-faire and you know, and then I'd go from that faculty to the law faculty, where everyone was like pretty straight and, you know, short back and sides and, you know, all that kind of thing. So I was straddling these 2 spheres, which I quite liked actually. I thought it was quite fun, and I was straddling them myself. I had really long hair and a beard, but I used to wear shorts. So somehow or other, I don't know, I can't remember exactly how, I managed to put myself through the next 3 years doing LLB in Cape Town, which was great.
And then we were talking also about your articles in South Africa, and,
Yes.
and the fact that was a real learning ground for you. So you started off not with a sort of a lofty ideal about law, more a question of, okay, I'm going to have to get a decent job in order to support my mum and potentially the rest of the family. But once you'd started on the path, then it seems a little bit like you and the law came together, even though that diverges a little bit later on. So tell us a little bit about the articles and what you learned from that whole process.
We had to do articles in those days. It was 2 years articles if you had the languages, 3 years if you didn't. But a lot of the firms used you as the person to go down to the magistrate's court and do what we call Section 65 work, which was basically debt collection work. And you had to appear in court, and you had to be tweetalig. In other words, you had to be able to speak English or Afrikaans, because the people in the court were entitled to use their own language, and so you might be required to speak Afrikaans to them. Eventually, I managed to find a small firm, a Jewish firm actually, who very kindly took me on because they didn't have much of that debt collection work, and I thrived there. Yeah, I mean, I guess because it was a small firm, I had to do a bit of everything, and I soon learned the importance of billing and getting your fees up every month, and making sure that you're covering your salary by at least 3 or 4 times, which in those days wasn't difficult, I might add. And so I got a taste of litigation. I got a taste of doing the debt collection work. I got a taste of property. I got a taste of briefing advocates and barristers and doing some high court work, and it was very good actually. And during that period, you had to do admission exams, and they were over a period of 2 days, and you could only start doing them when you'd had done articles for 2 years, I think. And so, and then if you passed those exams, you then had to go and do sit an oral with some of your fellow elderly lawyers, who would then ask you difficult questions, probably about the things that you'd stuffed up in the exam. and then if you passed that, they then questioned you on ethics. They called you back in and they asked you ethical questions. And then if you passed that, finally you got admitted. So I got admitted as an attorney in 1988, I think, which was a fantastic achievement, really, because I never really thought that I was going to be able to go through all of that, given the constraints in various forms.
I mean, it sounds like you've been, creating a resilience for yourself and resourcefulness. Whether that's your father, probably your father and your mother's spirit since the get-go. You'd had the experience then with this Jewish firm. How did that lead into ending up being in-house counsel at?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, at the time, I didn't realize, but actually, Dale Cohen, who was the guy who was the senior partner there. In fact, the only partner. No, there was another partner. He was doing quite a lot of Shell work, and in those days, the Shell, the oil company, work, and it's very strange for a small firm to be doing that. But I don't know, somehow they must have got into it with the mineral rights. And the mineral rights in those days in South Africa were privately owned. They weren't state owned. One of the few countries in the world where that was the case. In fact, it's still the case in Scotland with respect to base metals, or maybe even in the UK. But no, I know in Scotland for sure, and maybe England as well. But gold is reserved to the Crown in Scotland and England. So, there's a little bit of both. But anyway, in South Africa in those days, everyone held private mineral rights. And so there was a private mineral rights registry, and we used to do some of that. So I sort of got a bit of exposure to that. But I was offered partnership at Moscow and Partners, but I decided I wanted to go into commerce and go and see what it was like on the other side of the fence. I always thought it would be better to be where the decisions were made, rather than somebody just receiving instructions and doing the work and then off they go and you never see them again, sort of thing. And I quite enjoyed that. I worked for a big food company. And then I worked for Deloitte in their sort of financial planning side. I should also mention that I liked studying, so I carried on studying, and I did a postgrad diploma in high diploma in tax law and a high diploma in company law. So I had quite a good feel for the tax side of things, and when I joined Deloitte, and that was helpful. And then got the job at Anglo American in towards the end of 1992, I think.
And I mean, Anglo American, when you applied for the role, you must have had some sort of expectation of what an in-house counsel role at a huge, a big behemoth like Anglo American was going to be like. And how did that meet? How did the job actually meet your expectation, and or exceed or fall short? Was it what you expected, basically?
Yeah, I suppose the person you work for at an organization plays a big part in how much you enjoy it. It really does. And I had the most fantastic boss. I absolutely adored him. I mean, he was just such a nice person. And we traveled an awful lot together in that job. We got on exceptionally well. And although he used to give me a hard time, if I'd messed something up or hadn't thought of something or whatever, nevertheless, he did it in such a nice way that you're always just very wanting to continue to work with him and improve and all the rest of it. So that was a big aspect of it. When I joined Anglo, I'd come from Deloitte's, where we were dealing with high net worth individuals, but we were dealing in thousands or millions of rand. And suddenly in Anglo, on the first weekend I was there, we were doing a deal for a gold mine in Mali. We were negotiating, and we were dealing in millions and millions of US dollars, and the whole sort of, it was like a step change in how I was, I was suddenly exposed to all this international kind of negotiation and deal making. And I knew nothing very much about the mining industry at all. And so I was very much on a very steep learning curve there. But anyway, I didn't join their sort of in-house legal department, if you like. I was recruited into, they were looking for somebody with a bit of a commercial bent in their new mining business division, which was more to do with exploration. And Mandela had just been released around that time. And so the South African businesses, and of course Anglo, I don't know if you have any idea how Anglo straddled the South African economy in those days, but Anglo was South Africa. It owned everything, from car manufacturing to steel manufacturing to wineries to, all the different mining assets that you can think of. Anglo, when I first looked at an Anglo family tree, there was a little E.O. Oppenheimer Pty Limited at the top, and then there were just these masses and masses and masses of companies. So Anglo was South Africa, basically. And anyway, we were then able to go and travel out into the rest of Africa. And one of my first jobs was to go to Kenya, Uganda, and Burundi, and go and suss them out from an investment aspect, mining law aspect, tax aspect, and so on and so forth, with a group of geologists to go and come back and give give an overview of these countries as to whether we should be going to explore there, spend money there.
So although you joined this huge organization, actually your experience, because of the division you were in, was right up your street, actually, was as much commercial as legal and quite entrepreneurial. And that seems to have stuck with you ever since then, in terms of what you've done.
Yeah, I was always amazed, actually, how much freedom I had to put deals together and to go and find, somebody that we wanted to held a piece of ground in Tanzania and go negotiate with them and come back with the deal, and, it was done, kind of thing. So I loved that. I loved that freedom, and it sort of invigorated me, I suppose, because I wasn't, given some very strict rules as to what I could and couldn't do. I mean, I knew there were some basic parameters about what we wanted to end up with at the end of the day, but we were prepared to earn into these things and obtain an interest as we went along. So it was quite incredible that I had all this financial muscle behind me, and of course it opens doors everywhere. But on the other hand, you can go out and negotiate something and pretty much do your own thing to a large extent.
One of the things you said to me was that you really love negotiating. And obviously when you're an Anglo-American, as you said, you had the sort of this full financial might behind you. But what did it teach you over that period, and how has that been a sort of building block for your career to date or since then?
I think the primary thing was I always needed to find out what the other side wanted. Number one was I need to know what they want. What are their big hot button issues? What is a sine qua non for them? And if they were good enough to let me understand that, then I can find a creative way of working around what they needed and also working in what we needed, the typical win-win type thing. But I do remember sitting quite often in the boardroom there and with a bunch of people around the table, and we've got this problem, how do we solve it, kind of thing, and sort of cogitating and trying to come up with a plan. But that problem solving and that sort of creative aspect to it was I really enjoyed. I mean that was the fun part of it, and there's no limit to what you can, there really is no limit to how you can solve things. It's just, I guess it's just making sure that you're meeting what the expectations of the other side.
Because one of the brilliant things that you said to me, which I think really challenges a lot of perceptions about the law, is you love the law because it's creative.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time you said that, I sort of took a little step back and said, well, but the law is, in some way, simplistically, is about creating structure in order to facilitate things. And you came back and said, yes, but it's that structure that allows you to find solutions. And so for you, the law is about solutions finding, or sort of what you do in corporate and commercial.
Yeah, I mean, we all work within sort of broad constraints, I suppose, and sometimes it's very difficult to find ways around things. Like the stamp duty issue here for many years was very difficult, and people would go to great lengths to try not to pay stamp duty, and it creates all these contortions and unusual, structures that ordinarily you wouldn't even think about doing. But and sometimes you just can't avoid it. But a lot of the time, I think as I say, with the with the types of deals where you have a fairly free hand, being able to structure things so that you meet the other side's requirements, I think that does bring a whole level of creativity. And I mean, if anyone thinks practicing law is not being creative, I would very strongly argue against that. There are so many different ways of doing things. I mean, just incorporated or unincorporated joint ventures for a start, which is a stock in trade in the mining game. There are a million different ways of doing those and setting them up, and and it's really up to you to imagine, to work out what works best in the circumstances. So, yeah, I think it's very creative.
You first talked to me about creativity. I'd assumed that was you saying, well, I've kept the band going ever since the start, and that was sort of your creative outlet to sort of supplement what you were doing as a lawyer. And you said, no, actually many lawyers are creative people.
Yeah, and they are. I mean, it's amazing how many musicians I come across that are lawyers. I think they go together, actually. I mean, just for example, if you're working in litigation and you're working through the cases, often there's a creative way of looking at a particular case and coming up with an alternative argument that still uses that case. And that happens all the time. So I think lawyers are, and I think lawyers should be taught to be more creative if they're not, because you can push the boundaries with things if you really think about it. You don't have to. I mean, I've never been that interested in the sort of a black letter lawyer type approach. This is the law. You regurgitate what the law is. You tell your client that, and then that's it. This is the solution. I've always been more interested in, as I say, trying to find out what it is they want, and then working out, without sort of just going down the normal path, what alternatives. I'll give you an example. I was working with a mining company here that I ended up being chairman of, actually, but at the time I was just the lawyer, and they had a small gold deposit. It was quite small, maybe, I don't know, 50,000 ounces or something, and it was and it was beneath a lot of cover, so it wasn't easy to get to, and they were small. They weren't able to finance it themselves. They wouldn't have been able to get a bank loan to finance it. And so but the gold price was doing well, and they were wondering what they could do with this thing. And they didn't want to sell it, and probably nobody would have bought it anyway. So we sort of sat around thinking about that. And eventually we thought, why don't we go 50-50 with a contractor? We'll get a contractor to come in. We'll give them 50% of the gold. We won't pay them, but we'll give them 50% of the gold. And so they've got to dig the hole. They've got to put the gold on the run of mine pad, and then we'll process it, and we'll share the revenue 50-50. And that actually is what happened. Because the hole, we're not talking small little holes here. We're talking, you could put a small town down into this hole. They're big holes, and so it would probably took them a year just to get down to the gold. So a bit of a risk for the contractor, but the rewards, they were prepared to do it. So that was quite an innovative. In fact, we got an award, I think, in South Australia that year for the most innovative mining deal at that time. So, those kinds of things. Just looking at it a different way.
Because you've stretched your creativity, and one of the things you've said to me is you love the opportunity to do this because the chance to share and potentially to educate others within the legal profession is a real privilege. And you said that lawyers shouldn't just be lawyers. In fact, there's a lot of discussion nowadays about the modern lawyer needs to be more than a legal expert and needs to have EQ and empathy and negotiation skills and creativity. How do you touched on it earlier, how do you teach creativity? Because one of the ways you've maintained creativity is not just with the band, but also by being an entrepreneur and keeping interests on the commercial side with a series of mining interests. So if you were sort of advising other up and coming lawyers to be creative, what sort of things would you suggest?
I think you've just got to you've got to try and keep an open mind about things, and not be told that this is the way you do it, and that's the way that's always been done, and that's the way you do it, sort of thing. I remember my boss at Anglo, because he encouraged me a lot in this sort of thing, and I at one stage we had these joint ventures where we used to we used to sort of have an 80-20 kind of arrangement. And if we have ended up walking away from the thing, which we often did because we didn't find anything, we would just basically drop it. And I said to him, but you know, it seems to me we're dropping a lot of kind of potential value here going forward, because you know, it's okay. And first pass kind of, we haven't found anything. It doesn't mean there's nothing there. So maybe we should flip these things, and when we walk away, we give the other side the 80%, but we take their 20% just to keep a foot in the door, so that, you know, if they do end up finding something, you know, we remain involved. And you know, so that was something that you know, he thought was quite a good idea, and we actually started doing that. I guess it's just looking at things, you know, with a different mindset and thinking, yeah, okay, you know, this is the way it's always been done, but does it always have to be done this way? And I think sometimes you're driven actually in that direction anyway, when you're negotiating in a situation where it's a bit difficult and it's hard to work out how this is going to come to fruition. You then have to really start, you know, thinking about, well, let's try this, or maybe we could try that, or that kind of thing. And so I think it's keeping an open mind and realizing that, yes, you're working within this broad legal network, if you like, framework, but how you use that framework is really up to you, I think.
And
I'll give you another example of that. De Beers used to do sampling. They used to do 1 kilometer sampling, and they did it in Tanzania. And in one of these 1 kilometer samples, there was a gold hit. I mean, it's 1 kilometer square samples, right? I mean, it's like one little gold hit in a square K. The geologist who was in charge of Tanzania said to me, hey, we need to go and find out who owns this land, this mining license, or exploration license. So we went off hunting around, found this guy eventually. And actually, he was dying of AIDS at that time. He was a Tanzanian. And anyway, we found out that he'd already done a deal with a Canadian company. So we went and did a deal with this Canadian company. And from that one little sample in a square kilometer, it's now a Barrick gold mine of 5 million ounces of gold. Can you believe it? It's just incredible. And that all started out as being one little tiny anomaly in a square K.
And 5 million ounces, just to sort of put that in context, today's market value for that, because 5 million ounces sounds quite a lot, but I'm just trying to sort of get my head around what's the street value as such.
Well, that depends on whether you're just talking about the gold price or whether you're talking about the after costs price. But the gold price at the moment is what, I don't know, it's about $1,900 odd an ounce.
Okay.
So multiply 5 million by 1,900 and it'll be a lot. It'll be billions.
A lot. Excellent.
I can do it on my calculator while we're talking, if you like, although it may not be able to go that much.
So here's a question, probably an unfair question, Mark, but it's coming your way anyway. With everything you've done on the commercial side, on the legal side, in-house, you know, with
$9.5 billion.
9.5 billion, there we go. And entrepreneurially, and with the band on the side, and your mining ventures, looking back, and there's still a lot to come, what are you most proud of?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I guess I'm proud of the fact that I was able to get through those degrees. You know, at the time when you're doing it, you're young and you just kind of go with the flow, you know. But when I think about it now, it was, you know, it was touch and go. I mean, I remember I rented a digs from somebody in Cape Town. I couldn't pay them for the first 3 months. They must have thought, "Oh God, we've got a real one here," you know. So I think that. I guess I also I traveled a lot with Anglo, and eventually ended up being regional manager, posted to be regional manager in Perth for Australia and Asia. And I guess I really liked that, having that job. I you know, that was probably, I was, you know, probably one of the nicest positions that I had. I really I really enjoyed having that responsibility, but being part of that bigger group, you know, it was a nice feeling. And we made some bids for things at that time that if they'd come off, you know, my life would have probably been quite different, but they didn't. So, you know, eventually I moved on. But yeah, I think that I'm also obviously quite proud of releasing that second album, managing to do that second album in over a period of some 10 years. Actually, I think it took how long it took with everything else that was going on.
And you finished off the album. You finished off the album, you know, in the last 6 months, sort of, you know, under lockdown virtually. Is that right?
Yeah. We released it in July, so it was largely done by then. But yeah, I mean, well, we'd been doing it remotely anyway, quite frankly. So you know, the COVID thing actually didn't really have a great impact. I only went to Cape Town once to work with the guys directly for a couple of weeks, and the rest of it was done remotely. So, but I think that's the other important thing, a message, I guess, for people. You know, you get so focused on your work and trying to be the best you can and climbing the ladder, and you know, all the things that we all do when we're junior lawyers, and we feel like we need to work long hours and we have to work long hours and all that sort of thing. I think it's so important to have something else in your life that you really love, you know, whatever it might be. And I mean, I was in the habit of turning my phone off at night, because for me, a mobile phone was for my benefit, not for anyone else's, you know. So, you know, you leave work at a certain time and you go and you shut it out and you go and do something else. I know you can't. I know it's not often easy. And when I was managing director of an ASX listed company, I was always on call. So, you know, I sort of understand that's difficult. And I think especially for lawyers, where you're sort of really into it the whole day, and the day can just disappear. I really think it's important to have something else outside of that, where you don't even think about work and you go off and you do your pottery or your bloody music or your acting or your drama or, you know, whatever it is that really, sailing, which, you know, whatever turns you on. I think it's so important for people to have an outlet like that in their lives.
Your life and your sort of work and life journey has been all about sort of overcoming things and perseverance. But also, when opportunities have presented themselves, you've grabbed them.
Yes, I requalified as a lawyer in Australia, but you had to work for somebody for a couple of years, like not articles, but just, you know, working for somebody who was a qualified lawyer here to finish off being able to have an unrestricted practicing certificate. And I'd never done that because I'd basically been, you know, my own boss in the situations I'd been in for years. So when the mining industry turned down in sort of 2011-12, I thought, maybe I'd better go and do this now, because I've always had this view that, you know, when you get old, it's a bit of a generalization, but when you get old in a company, you sort of almost become like surplus to requirements quite often, these days especially. But when you get old in a consulting arena, you're more and more sought after, because you know, you have all this experience and all this gray hair and all these wrinkles and, you know, everything else that goes with experience. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'd better set myself up now to go back into practice and and start doing that again. So I came down from Perth to Adelaide. My wife was from Adelaide anyway, so, you know, quite pleased to get back here. We were married in the hills here, and joined a law firm. Lasted there about 18 months. Wasn't my cup of tea, really. But because I think working for someone else when you'd done what I'd done was always going to be difficult. But I managed to convince the Law Society that I didn't really need to do 2 years anyway, because I had all this experience and they agreed with me. So I left and then set up my own thing and went from there. And along came the Lao business. So, you know, I went and looked at that, and we bolted that on. And so Arionlegal was born, and we went from strength to strength.
And you said to me the other day that almost a sort of thoughtful, off the cuff comment. For everything I've done, I've always been a lawyer. So what has the law meant to you then? What's that golden thread been?
You know, when I first went into practice, I guess I was so happy to get articles, because I'd really been struggling to find articles. I was so happy to be, you know, becoming a professional. And I finally understood what being a professional was. You were considered to be equal with everyone else in that organization, and you were expected to pull your weight and solve problems and get on with it, you know. And if you had to go out and do X, Y, or Z, well, you went out to do X, Y, and Z. You didn't have to account to people for your time. You were considered to be a professional, and so you would get the work done, you know, and you do what needed to be done. And I really thrived on that, you know, because I'd had a couple of jobs when I was at university and in between, and you know, those jobs were very much you know, sort of you were an employee, and, you know, there's somebody watching you all the time, and if you're a minute late, you got crapped on, and, you know, that kind of thing. And suddenly I was in the situation where I was being treated, you know, as a professional. And I loved that. I really loved that. And, you know, we used to discuss issues, you know, we used to have a lunch once a week with the senior partner, and we used to talk about all sorts of things that were going on. It just felt very collegiate, and I really liked that. And so I guess I always liked being a lawyer as such. And although I moved in-house, I was still essentially being a lawyer. Yes, I guess with a much more commercial bent, perhaps. And, you know, you're working within an organization that has its own ways of doing things and what have you. But, you know, I guess I always took that sort of professional, I'm a professional, with me, you know, in whatever I did, and always felt that, you know, I went through a lot to get qualified, and, you know, I'm very sort of proud of the fact that I have that, you know.
But we shouldn't test you on your Afrikaans, is what you're saying.
Near donkey.
Very good, very good. So the other thing that's been your golden thread has been your music. Something that, you know, there's not too many people in the world can say they knocked Michael Jackson off the #1 spot. And, you know, it may have been in Zimbabwe back in the 80s, but
Yes.
that's still some achievement. So,
well, it felt good at the time, anyway.
I bet it did, and Gutter the band has stayed together, or stayed in touch for all this time. You've just released a new album, your Opus Pandemius, I suppose we'll call it.
Yes, good way of putting it.
Can you give us a blast of something? Do you have your guitar to hand? I mean, a good musician always does.
Yes, but are you wanting me to play something, or
why not? Just, you know, because we built it up that, you know, you've been in a band, so you know,
it's going to sound crap. You know, it's going to sound crap, don't you?
It's over Zoom. We do.
It's going to sound terrible,
but that's fine.
This is This is a guitar I bought only about a year or so ago. Actually, I'm quite pleased with it. It's an Australian make. You probably won't hear it all that well, but I did, the last song on the album is called Come Back and See the World, and this was actually the guitar I used, although I've got another, when I say I bought this 2 years ago, the previous acoustic that I bought was in 1980. So it's a major, it was a major thing for me to buy this guitar. And I mean, I've bought electrics obviously, but acoustic wise, this is only the second one I've ever bought. And so I took the old acoustic and I put 12-string, thin 12-string, the thin 12-string strings on it. And I played that as well as this. And then so it sounds like a 12-string on the recording. So when you hear the recording, it won't sound like this. And while you're flying high, don't think the world can pass you by. People want to stay by themselves sometime. Never worry about the way people always point and say he's crazy. So come back and see the world someday. Oh, come back and see the world someday.
That is definitely, if Come Back and See the World Someday is not a song for our times, I don't know what is. And that is absolutely definitely a Mackrell International first, which I'm not sure we would have had it not been for the pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So,
but we did talk about possibly putting the band together for the AGM sometime. So that'll be something we should work on.
We have a promise from Mark that if we can get enough musicians together across the Mackrell International network, that Alison, you should probably feed this into Nigel, that we have our very own band. So Mark, look, one of the brilliant things about Mackrell International has been our ability to keep connected through the last few months with everything that's going on and support each other. And as I said, ironically, we've been forced apart, and yet we probably wouldn't be having this Mackrell International Mentor Series this way. We would never have had the opportunity to sort of talk about your life and work journey the way we have, and to hear you play, Mark. So that's been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.